You're listening to Blossoming Technologist, a podcast for young professionals in tech discovering skills, careers, and tips for being in the tech industry. I'm your host, Marissa, and today we're joined by Shannon Jackson, an engineering manager of engineering operations at Chime. In her role, she creates and crafts everything operational that makes a healthy, happy, and lasting engineering organization. Before being an engineering manager, Shannon was a Ruby software developer. She is also a founding member and curriculum builder for Mystery Code Society, a nonprofit championing gender equity in tech through beginner and intermediate coding education for people of marginalized genders. Today, we're going to discuss engineering operations, a newer role in tech found at several companies. We'll cover what engineering operations is, how to know if it's a good fit for you, and so much more. I'm so excited. Shannon, welcome to the show.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so happy to have you here too. I always start with what first got you interested in the tech industry.
So I was definitely from a non-tech background. When I went to college, it was for theater and sociology. And then I was working for arts organizations and nonprofits, like very, very, very far away from anything technical. And I was really into volunteering for nonprofits and things like that. And this volunteer opportunity came up where they said that they were trying to create a website for voters in Arizona who didn't speak English, which is like a huge population in Arizona. And they were really being left behind by other candidates because they just like weren't appealing to that demographic. And I was like, man, I wish I could help with that. That would be so cool. Like I can stuff 100 envelopes, or I could make one website and like literally change like millions of people's lives. And I made a joke about it to one of my board game friends who was in tech, where I was like, wouldn't it be hilarious if I learned how to code and made this website? And he was like, no, that would be great. You would be great at that. Here are the reasons why I think you would be great at that. And I still thought it was really funny, but eventually decided to go to a coding boot camp and got in and then
Yay.
did it. And it worked out really nicely. And I actually really liked coding. It was a lot more like solving puzzles or like building an engine. And I just never considered it for myself. And so then once I actually tried it, I realized that I actually really, really liked it. So.
Wow. And it started with a joke. That's crazy.
It started with a joke that has like now like 10 years later is like my reality. So.
Oh my gosh. Okay. And now you are an engineering manager. Actually, could you tell me, like, how did you end up in that role? Like, what was that path to engineering manager?
So I got really lucky right when I got out of code school. I got a very good job. And with all of their new hires, they sort of put them on are we going to invest in this person for like our senior technology track or for our management track? And from my interview, they really thought that I would be a good manager. I'm very empathetic and I've led a lot of like teams before in that sort of capacity, even though it wasn't in technology. So I got put in that track pretty early and was able to become an engineering manager there. I don't know how many engineering managers you've had on the podcast, but depending on what company you're at, how technical that engineering manager position is like really different from company to company based on like the size and what their investments are and things like that. So I was able to become an engineering manager before I was even a senior engineer. And then I've just kind of dipped in between, sort of switching between going back to Ruby, going back to engineering management, and now going into Eng Ops, depending on the roles and what I was really needing at the time. Before I jumped into this role, I'd been working as a Rubyist for a couple of years, and the pandemic happened, and it seemed like people in technology were like really getting burnt out so quickly and really getting left behind and really being like abused by the industry. And so I really wanted to jump back into engineering management to sort of put a Band-Aid over the dam, I guess. Like, I don't know what I thought I was going to do. Like just my protect one team. And then I heard about this position, which was basically getting to put Chime didn't really need a Band-Aid, but to be able to like take care of an entire engineering org in that way. So I was really excited about that.
Ooh, that's so exciting. I know We could totally dig into engineering management, but I do want to talk about engineering operations instead. I'm like, I have to find another engineering manager to have on the podcast. I've never had an engineering manager. So we'll come back to that. But
Okay.
engineering operations. So you mentioned it to me and I had never heard of it before. So I'm sure others have not heard of it. What is engineering operations?
Sure. So I will give you the fancy spiel and then I will give you the less fancy spiel. So
Okay.
engineering operations, which sometimes I'll refer to as Eng Ops, is a team that is specifically charged with designing and building programs and operationalizing those extra things that go into the effectiveness and happiness of engineers and engineering managers. So if you look at an engineering organization, there's a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with coding or software delivery that you need to have in order to hold that organization together. So, some examples would be like the career ladder, the interviewing processes, internal mobility programs, mentorship programs, onboarding. All of those things are really important in order to make sure that your engineers can do their jobs, your engineering managers can do their jobs. But in smaller organizations and traditionally, that was just like an extra workload that was never assigned to anyone. So
Yeah.
engineering managers would do it in their free time, which doesn't exist, or engineers would sort of pick it up out of like a point of frustration or like out of the goodness of their heart. So a good example would be like your onboarding program. You're a junior engineer, you come to a new company, it's a terrible onboarding experience. Your computer doesn't work. You can't get your dev environment set up. It all is horrible and it just ruins your life for a couple of weeks. And then you say, okay, you know what? I'm going to write some documentation so that the next time this happens, orientation for a new person's going to be better. So that's
Yeah.
usually how this stuff gets done. At a really big organization, like once you start to scale, you can't do that anymore because one, you need consistency, you need quality, and everyone is too busy to sort of maintain those sorts of things. So, in large organizations or organizations that are like really devoted to a good engineering culture, that's where NJOP those organizations start to form.
Gotcha. And I feel like stuff like onboarding documentation, for example, that's a thing that a lot of engineers don't want to do. I feel like, like for me, I'd say I'm a little different as an engineer where I love writing onboarding documentation. So I'm like known at not at my company, but like across the teams I've been on to be the one who just like spins up a document and writes out like all the stuff you have to know. And so when I was reading about engineering operations, I was like, oh my God, have I secretly been doing engineering operations for this long?
Yes, exactly. Like I said, I was looking for a new engineering manager job, and my boss, I've actually worked with for like, I've known for like 12 years. And I said, is there any engineering manager positions open at Chime? Like, I really want to like get back in the weeds. And he's like, I need you to read this article that Dropbox wrote about engineering operations. And it was literally like just describing everything that I had ever done. Where it was like the things that I really loved about my job as just its own job. And that
Yeah.
was incredible to me. And I got so excited. And I was the first hire on our NJOPS team. And now we're a group of 5. But yeah, it really spoke to me as someone who traditionally was just doing these things out of the goodness of my heart.
Yeah. That's
And now to have like
amazing.
time to do it is incredible.
Wow. We will link that article in the show notes because that's the article you sent me to read.
Yeah.
So I'll make sure if people want to read more about the role, you can read that article. But let's dig into it more. So, as an engineering manager in engineering operations, that is a mouthful. What does your day to day look like?
Sure. Yeah, it is a mouthful. And I have to like abbreviate it on Zoom and it's just like forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my day to day is sort of split into like 3 buckets. So my team altogether works on really large initiatives addressing like the real big needs of Chime engineering. And then about 30% of my time, I have a specific pillar within Eng Ops, which is our recruiting, interviewing, and hiring practices. So about 30% of my time is crafting new initiatives within that space. And then about 30% of my time is maintaining the programs that I've already created. And that's kind of the big thing that Eng Ops has. Like our biggest advantage is just time. So if it in a smaller organization or people who don't have Eng Ops, a brilliant director or VP might say, like, I'm going to I'm going to rewrite our entire internship program. And then they rewrite it. And then they have to go back and do their VP director stuff. And the questions don't get updated. They could get leaked to the internet and nobody knows. Like, there aren't any metrics really tied to whether or not the interns are being successful. Like, maybe the onboarding documentation gets out of whack. So within even like 6 months, what was a beautiful, robust internship program that this person put a lot of time into is now starting to decay. So, so some of my job is like literally just like assigning data and metrics to things that haven't had data and metrics before, and tracking those things and updating things that we, previously we did a really good job at one point in time, and then nobody owned it. And it's one of those things where, like, if nobody owns it, if everybody owns it, then nobody owns it, I guess is like a better way to put it. So just like that ownership and time is a huge part of our jobs. And so I also meet with a lot of the leaders and the engineers within our organization to sort of get consensus and get input. And I have a lot of working groups based on the different initiatives that we have. So it's a lot of meetings in my day-to-day, and a lot of documentation, but it's also really like digging into some like big meaty projects, kind of like 3 different projects that you can work on with Eng Ops. Like, this thing doesn't exist and it needs to. This thing is okay, but needs to be better. And like, this thing is good, but could be great. And so that's sort of like the 3 buckets that we work off of. So you start with like, oh, we need it, so let's have it. And then there's some things where it's like, well, if I just really like read a couple of books and met with some people and we all like came to a consensus, could this be the new standard for an engineering career ladder or something like that? So.
Gotcha. A lot of these things that you're building out, do those come as like requests from different engineering teams and requests from leadership, and then your team kind of figures out how to make that happen?
We do planning almost as if we were a software team. So we have like H1 goals and H2 goals, and that's sort of based on what our understandings are. But our team is also a lot more flexible than a software team. So if a VP or even like an engineer reports something and we're like, oh, that is something we have to address right now, then we have a lot more flexibility to shift. Yeah. But we have a lot of metrics that we're also going off of: employee engagement surveys, engineer sentiment surveys, and then just like some systemic issues where if you notice that people seem burnt out or something like that, like, how do you dig in and find out like where that's coming from? So we have sort of some back burner initiatives too, where it's like, this seems like maybe people are starting to not feel great about X, Y, or Z. Let's start to look into why that's happening.
Yeah. And because I know it's engineering operations, which is like, my company does not have an engineering operations. We have operations. So I'm trying to think of like how those are maybe similar or different. Can you kind of speak on like why it matters to have engineering operations rather than just operations?
That is a really good question. So I'm going to take my pillar within Eng Ops to sort of explain why that is true for us. So we have a recruiting department, and they do a great job. They're great at finding people, and like those processes are all in place. But there's specific things with engineering interviewing that are different, like what technical assessments are like, what distributed design system assessments are like, the ways that we're evaluating, how we have bias and things like that in our interview process is slightly different than how, if someone's interviewing for marketing, those biases might look different and those processes look really different. So engineering operations is its own operations team within engineering to specifically address those issues. So why is an engineering intern different from a marketing intern? Why is our interview process different from their interview process? Why is our metrics different? Also, like, what does a career ladder look like for an engineer versus someone in another department? Like, there's so much debate across the entire industry about what the different levels are like and what the different titles mean and those sorts of things. And it's just nice for someone to have a lot of context. I think it's also nice that I used to be an engineer and I used to be a traditional engineering manager, so that I can take that context and what, for example, as a candidate, as someone who's done a lot of tech interviews, I also know what we hate, what we hate and have, like, what is a bad tech interview like? I definitely have some experience there to say, no, do not ask that question. Nobody wants that question. It won't even tell you what you think it's going to tell you. Don't do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That's really awesome. I feel like hearing about it makes me think like every company needs this. Like this sounds so good, especially when you have like such a big engineering culture. You're convincing me. I if I ever owned an engineering company, I'd be like, all right, engineering operations, first department.
Yeah, and it's hard to justify having an engineering ops team since it is something that could in theory be picked up by other roles.
Yeah.
The sad thing is, like, by the time you can justify an eng ops team, you maybe needed it like a year ago.
Yeah.
And I know that there's lots of, especially in like San Francisco and places like that, there's these teams that grow super quickly and the culture does not catch up with them. So, it was four guys in a basement sitting at the same table. And so they didn't need documentation because they'd just be like, hey, Kyle, how do you do this thing? And then Kyle would tell them. And then there's suddenly a 300-person engineering team and there's no documentation and Kyle's been gone for months. So yeah. So kind of by the time Eng Ops comes in, there's like a lot of work to do, but it also means that, you really have the justification for why your team needs it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, in your role, how have you seen your work in engineering operations help the engineers in your company?
I love that question. So one is just a lot of relief and a lot of time back to engineers and engineering managers. They don't have to think about who's in charge of these things. They can just ask me. It's nice to have a point person to talk to about some of this stuff. And also, like, it gives everyone a little bit of breathing room to do the things that they actually want to do. Like you said, not everyone wants to write documentation or not everyone wants to make an onboarding process. I think our onboarding process is maybe the best example of what
Yeah.
we've done. So our onboarding process is spectacular for engineers. Like, it's really robust, it's really operationalized, like there's a clear like system for every engineer that comes on. And we've gotten so much feedback from our new engineers where it's like, that was the least painful onboarding I've ever had. Like,
Oh, it's amazing.
your computer's set up, all of the different teams are explained to you, all of your expectations are set, and then you can just actually like make software. So I think that's like a really something that we're really doing well, and also like a really good point of why having like a team devoted to it sort of makes everything more consistent and higher quality, because we have the context of the entire organization too behind us and the things we're doing.
Yeah. And I think onboarding documentation and the process is such a good example because when you join a company, that is your first impression of how the company runs, how it feels. Like you're the most confused you're ever going to be, hopefully. And like if you have a good onboarding process, then like you're great. You can just get started. You can do the job that you got hired for. Otherwise, you're just confused and you don't even know who to ask.
Right. And even like as a senior engineer, if your Docker's not starting up and like your environment is all messed up, you're just like, do I know anything? Like, why did they even hire me if I can't get this thing to run? And so it's a huge like morale like dampener right at the beginning of starting at a great new company. And so we've really like put a lot of time into making that a much better and nicer experience. And then like that, the managers that are getting these people, like they don't have to spend a bunch of time setting up their environments and getting them access to all the things. Like we're doing all of that for them, and they just get this beautiful, calm, confident candidate who can actually like start to work with them.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. It's like you make managers' lives easier and the developers' lives easier. Like, it just, everyone in engineering benefits.
Yes. Yes. That's the hope.
Yeah. So you talked about this briefly, but I'd love to hear if there's anything else. But like, how did you know that this role was a good fit for you?
Well, when I read the article, I thought, well, that's me. But I also was like, well, am I just going into a role because I think I'm going to be good at it, or am I actually going to be good at it? Like, is it actually going to challenge me? Is it actually going to be fun? And something that was unexpected about the role that I actually really like. So I said that I went to college for theater and sociology, and it really
Yeah.
feels kind of like being a sociologist, or maybe like anthropologist, because some of the questions are, what do we do right now? But why? Who made that decision? When did we make that decision? What was different about the organization when we made that decision? So, the org I'm at right now went through this massive change of growth in like 2020 to like 2022. We like, I don't know, quintupled our engineering department.
Oh my
And
God.
so, any decisions that we made in 2019, we were a different organization then. Like, we have way more teams, we have different orgs within those teams, we're working on completely different things. So what an interview, for example, looked like when we were trying to no longer be 40 people, and an interview when we're 1,500 people, like, those are very different things. So literally just like wading through Google documents, tracking down comments, figuring out why something is built the way it is and if that still serves us. I think that was like the first time that I was like, I love this. Which is an incredibly nerdy thing to say. I was like, I was in a Google Doc and decided I loved my job, but that is also a good indicator if you're into engineering operations. If you're like, oh my goodness, documentation auditing, I would love it. Like, then
Yeah,
we're
I
here for
love
you.
that. It sounds like you're actually like, kind of using the degree that you got originally. Even theater, like, you have to talk to people all the time. Like, it's kind of a performance,
Yes, yes, I do. I do think that especially when I'm doing like a podcast or a panel or something like that, I'm like, I know how to keep a tight five, and I'm not afraid of talking to people. I'm willing to jump into a meeting with a very high up executive and act like I'm not scared. There were a lot of people who were like in my code school class and things like that, especially boot camps have like a variety of backgrounds in them. And there were a lot of artistic people in mine, lots of musicians, artists, actors. And I think a lot of people have been transitioning, especially in like the last 10 years or so, out of those into technology. And I think that we as an industry are benefiting from that a lot because we're getting those other skills on top of what we have already taught them.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I feel like I'm a consultant, so I get to kind of jump into different industries every now and then. I'll jump through projects. And recently I was doing more stuff in like the healthcare industry. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, my tech skills are so beneficial to the healthcare industry. And then others who are in healthcare, like, some of that stuff can carry over into tech. And it's just so interesting to think about that, like, crossover between industries and how beneficial it is to have that knowledge. Like, I also had a conversation recently with a friend who is currently in agriculture, and he's like, oh yeah, like, I'm interested in getting into tech. And I said, oh my gosh, like, your agriculture skills, I don't know how they fit into tech, but I'm sure they will, like, help you in the tech industry and bring that perspective. Oh, it's so
Absolutely.
amazing.
Yes. I was a
Yeah.
consultant for a number of years, and like that, becoming a domain expert in all these like weird little
Yeah.
things, as you're like, okay, I now suddenly know so much about like the optometry board reviews, and I don't know if I'm going to use that for the rest of my life, but man, I have a lot of very specific knowledge about these specific applications. It's
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, that's how I feel. The other question I wanted to ask you, because you said how this role almost felt like you were reading that article and it felt like perfect, it was for you. Something I've been thinking about a lot recently is like choosing a role based on your strengths rather than maybe your weaknesses or the things you want to work on. I don't know if you felt this too, but it feels like this role is like something where you could hone your strengths. Have you felt that as someone in engineering operations? And like, I don't know, how has that like played into maybe your career and your career growth?
I think that for engineering operations, especially, it is like a different branch, like it's a different career branch from engineering management, even though I am an engineering
Yeah.
manager. So when you're an engineer, you sort of go on this path. And then there's a moment when you're a senior engineer where they say, do you want to keep going and try to be like a principal engineer or a staff level engineer? And then there's do you want to be an engineering manager? Maybe down the line you become a director or something like that. And engineering operations is really like a different path to say, like, you're not going to be one of these two things anymore. You're going to be a new third thing. And so I think that the real thought that I had there was that since I wasn't a technical person before I got into tech, I really took a lot of pride in suddenly being considered a technical person and being told, like being able to tell people like, I'm a developer, I write code. And now I'm taking that step back, even though my technology background is really beneficial to me in Eng Ops. It's not really viewed as much as a technical role. And so like, I kind of lost that point of pride there. And if I went back into engineering now, I would take a step back because now I haven't been coding for a year. And they shouldn't let me write any code at the moment. But yeah, so I think that that's like kind of the big thing where it was both what do I want to get better at and like what am I willing to give up? Because I could have stayed on engineering manager path and still been pretty technical and probably, depending on the company, like maybe even gotten into the code base once or twice. And looking at what Eng Ops was like offering me, like giving up that technical side was like worth it for me.
Yeah. So interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I was just curious because that's what I've been thinking about a lot. So for anyone who might be interested in starting in engineering operations or like looking for a job in Eng Ops, what advice would you give to them?
Sure. So Eng Ops is still a leadership position. So you probably would want to have like some coding or even engineering management under your belt before you start looking for these roles. Those other umbrella roles that we're talking about, like developer advocates and developer experience roles, maybe don't need as much technical experience as Eng Ops does, just because your path is a little more laid out there. Since Eng Ops is a newer discipline, you're kind of hacking through this big field of weeds and figuring out what you're doing at the same time. And that's a little easier if you have more experience. So while you're sort of working through your own career stuff, really documenting those extra things that you're doing, which is maybe just my advice to everyone. If you are doing things that are extra outside of your workload, like just like literally keep a Google sheet or something that says like, they needed help with the interns. I did these things. Like, here's the things that the interns sent to me over Slack. So that's great for you, like even if you're still going to be an engineer, because when your reviews come up and stuff like that, it's nice to be able to say, here's impact that I'm making. But it's also great so that when you're considering like, do I want to go over there? It's like, are these the things that I'm most proud of? Are these the things that I really loved doing? And then as you're getting into like interviews for this role, you can bring those things up, because even though you haven't been in engineering ops before, most people haven't. It's really new and not a lot of companies have it, but a lot of people have experience that still really ties to it. So I think that would be my big point. And also what I was saying before, like really evaluating if you are willing to like take a step back from technology and go into something completely different, or if you're in other forms of engineering leadership, whether that's engineering management or high level developers, some of this stuff is still built into their jobs. So if you want to reboot interview programs and mentor interns and things like that, like as a principal engineer, you're still definitely going to be doing that. You'll still get to do that work. But if the stuff that you want to do is all the extra stuff, then considering a career in Eng Ops or something like it would probably be a great bet.
Yeah. I really love that advice of like keeping track of everything that you've done, because I started doing that fairly recently whenever I'm in a new role. Like when I was tech lead last year, I knew it was like a short stint. I was tech lead for like 5 months or something. And every week I would just make a list of like what happened, what I did, whatever. And at the end, I was like, oh my God, like I learned so much and I didn't realize until I like looked back at that list. So it's so helpful going into, like you said, performance interviews or performance reviews, even if you're applying for a new job, whatever it is, so helpful for any role. I love
Right.
that.
Or if you're like feeling a little bit of that imposter syndrome, going back and being like, I have actually like grown and made impact here, because there's also like some recency bias where if I ask you like, how do you like being a developer? If you like just came off of an incident and you like worked 36 hours in a row and you're like red-eyed and burnt out and you're like, I hate it. I don't want to do this anymore. But saying like, oh, like let me look over this last 6 months. It's not always like that.
Yeah.
It's a good reference point.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing I really want to talk about is glue work, because you mentioned how engineering operations work can often be glue work if you don't actually have that role and you're doing this work before like taking it on officially. So before I jump into that, what is glue work for anyone who's never heard of it?
Sure. So I think glue work was coined by Tanya Riley. So she has this great talk, which is called Being Glue, which I recommend to everyone, especially underrepresented people in tech. So if you are not a man, or if you are not white, or if you're not traditionally represented in technology, like you absolutely have to read Being Glue. So Tanya is a senior principal engineer at Squarespace. So she is a highly technical person in a highly technical role. But she was talking about this phenomenon, which is that especially like earlier career, mid-career folks would be tasked with all this extra work that is absolutely essential to hold a team or a project together, like documentation or writing tests or onboarding, but it's not actually assigned to anyone. So it is extra work. It's absolutely necessary, but it's not actually tied to your performance or your career growth. And the point that she makes, and the point that I like to make, is that usually glue work falls on those underrepresented people. So women traditionally are much more likely to volunteer when they see a gap. And underrepresented folks in general, like they know how hard it was to get there. They know how hard it was to be there. And they want to make it easier for other people, which is absolutely a noble goal. But it means that when performance review comes around, not that that's like the be all end all, but if you're looking for a promotion or if you're looking for a new title and most of your impact was not code based, it's really easy for your manager or your boss to say, you know, you're not really performing where we think you are, because all of the impact and all of the work and most of your time is put into this extra stuff, which is absolutely important and is holding the work together. But since it's not in your job description, it can kind of be seen as, I guess, your hobby. Your hobby
Yeah.
was writing documentation. And even though everyone's benefiting from it, they don't really see it as the impact that you're making.
I actually like my current role. I'm a developer, and before I took on this project, someone sent me Tanya's talk and was like, "Hey, I think you should watch this." Okay, so I watched this Being Glue, feel very seen, and going into my new role, I was like, "Okay, I'm not doing any glue work." And so I joined my project. I was like, "I am just a developer. I will not do onboarding documentation. I will not do this." I lasted maybe a month, and then I was like, okay, I need to fix the onboarding docs. I need to do this, do that. And so it's like, built into me to do that stuff. And I think a lot of people feel that too, where it's like, you feel like you need to do it because it could be better and you can make it better. Like you're the person to do that.
Right. Absolutely. And I think Tanya has some great advice in that talk. I think my advice for it too is just to be really explicit with your manager and even with your team if necessary, to say like someone needs to do this documentation. And if I'm going to do it, I just want you to know that's going to take me away from coding, and like really just being overly communicative about the stuff that you're doing, both communicating it to yourself and like keeping track of it in that sheet, like I was talking about, but also really being clear with your manager, like, I am choosing to do this because the team needs it. And like, how does that fit in with the other career conversations that we've been having?
Yeah.
Because the sad thing about glue work too is that lots of times you think people are seeing the impact of it. You think people can tell how much of an effect you're having on the team. And if they don't see it, then that was work that you, not that you did for nothing, because I don't think that making everyone's lives easier is ever done for nothing, but you should benefit from it as much as the company is benefiting from you.
Yeah. It's like not the same scale almost. Like at the same scale as like your performance reviews for, producing good code, really, I don't know, finishing stories quickly or whatever it is. And then you're doing things that are on the back end that like people just don't think of and don't think of as part of their role because, as a developer, it's not part of your role.
Right. But it has to be part of somebody's role. And I think that
Yeah.
really good engineering cultures, like really good companies that have really invested in this, like they are really explicit with that expectation. So they say like interviewing is part of your job, documentation is part of your job, writing tests is part of your job. Like this is what it means to be a good engineer. And so like at good companies, you can definitely find places where that sort of work is built into your expectations and is part of that culture. There are definitely some companies where they're like, I don't know how that all got done, but it did. And then there's some companies where they're like, nobody did it. Nobody volunteered to do it. We didn't give anybody time to do it. And we do not have any documentation. And so really, I guess that's also like a bit of advice is if you are having that conversation with your manager and they're like, well, I really just want you to get some tickets done, then that's a point of data for you where you're like, okay, well, does that mean that I don't do this stuff? Does that mean I do this stuff, but I'm really mindful about what I say no to? Like, which of these things do I absolutely feel has to be done by me? And when is it like, oh, okay, cool, then this isn't a place that I'm going to keep working?
Yeah.
Because I think all of us have had that experience where you just like realize that the culture at your work was not what you wanted. And that's a good piece of information to know.
Yeah. And then you have some companies where they're like, hey, actually, we have an engineering operations department and we will do that glue work.
Right. So I think so we're a newer organization and we're a newer discipline within tech. So I guess one of the challenges of engineering operations is people even realizing that they don't have to. So some of my job is just being like, hey, I heard you were worried about this. You can help me do it, but you don't have to do it. Like that, I think is huge. And we have a lot of who I affectionately call big-hearted weirdos. We have a lot of big-hearted weirdos at Chime who like want to work on documentation, want to work on making processes better, those sorts of things. And so like they're great partners to have. But it's like, but if you get tired or you have like a sprint or an incident or something, like you can put it down. It's not going to be dropped. Like somebody is
Yeah.
here to help you out. And I think that is like really, I mean, engineering operations is just like a good thing for a company. Makes your engineering culture more healthy. It makes everybody happier. It makes it easier to get stuff done. And also it's like, it's a benefit. Like if I go to this company, I'm not going to have to do a bunch of stuff that I don't want to do because it's actually someone's job.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds like paradise as a developer, being able to just be like, hello, engineering operations. Can you please help me? Or can you please take this on? Thank you. And
Right.
go back to your
Right.
development work.
Right. And a lot of it, I think some of the things I built are also like based on my own frustrations, like
Yeah.
our interviewer training program. I'm like, if I was an interviewer, I would be so stressed out I know that there are companies where they're like, hey, can you do a technical interview today? And you have no idea like what that role is, what questions you're supposed to use, or just come up with something. And like, that's just a state of horror. And so I'm like, okay, well, like similar to you, it's like, well, what would I want my onboarding process to be for this? And then I just make like my dream. And then I'm like,
Yeah.
is this anyone else's dream? Do I need to make any updates to make it somebody else's dream? And then like we can iterate on that process. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. I think this was a great introduction to engineering operations. I feel like I've learned so much. I hope others feel like they've learned a lot and can, research the role more if this feels like it's resonated with you. But I actually want to wrap up. So I have one final question that I ask every guest, which is, what is one skill that you're currently working on?
Okay, this isn't going to undo some of the things that I've already said, but
Oh no.
I have been dipping my toes back into Ruby again, just recreationally, definitely not in the Chime code base. Nobody gets scared.
Yeah, we won't hold it against you.
But Avdi Grimm has this great website called graceful.dev, which has super helpful videos, like both for beginners and for people who have been working in Ruby for a long time. And so just like really, it's since I haven't been in a code base in a while, there are some new things that like the latest versions of Ruby can do that are pretty neat. And so I've been looking into those just so I can keep my ear to the ground about what's new with my favorite coding language.
Very cool. No, I'm not going to talk about Ruby. I'm not a big fan of Ruby, but we can talk about that afterwards.
What language do you like?
I prefer JavaScript if I'm going to like code in the language, but also like backend more Java or Python. I don't know. I haven't had a good experience, but we can discuss.
Okay. I think it's like a favorite flavor of ice cream. Like there's definitely reasons why you feel that way or I feel this way. But in the end, it's all, all just there.
You're like, great interview, but wow, you really had to end on that. Anyway.
And honestly, no, I'm very impressed because I feel like Ruby is a language that's very close to like American English. So
okay.
Like writing it out like feels very intuitive to me, and that Java does not feel intuitive to me. So you saying like, oh, I like to write Java on the back end, I'm like, that is impressive. That's like, not to sound like I have imposter syndrome, but sometimes I'm like, oh, that's like real coding, which I shouldn't say about Ruby, which is my first love. But
no, I mean, I think because I've struggled so much trying to learn Ruby, like knowing Ruby, I'm like, oh my God, like she's legit, versus like I learned Java in college, got a computer science degree, learned Java, whatever, but have never, like I've touched Ruby here and there and not great. But that's okay. That's besides the point.
That's all right.
Thank you so much.
We can still be friends.
We can still be friends.
We don't love the same languages. Sure.
Cool. Thank you so much, Shannon, for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you on the show. Like, I loved hearing everything about engineering ops, about being an engineering manager, about Ruby, all that stuff. For anyone listening, check out our show notes for any resources that we mentioned, as well as how to connect with Shannon. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time where we'll continue blossoming together.